Kia ora everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've had the Finance Minister Grant Robertson announce his fifth budget 2022, with really a huge amount of cash being poured out, but expectations of even more to come. Now, unlike most budgets where there really is a central focus, this time round, Grant did seem to have quite a few things to get going with. With immediate concern was very much the cost of living challenge, the government therefore pulling $1 billion out of its back pocket to fund continued road user charge cuts and fuel excise cuts. So petrol and buying rucks will be cheaper for the next 2 months still. And then after that, the government announcing a $350 a week, costing $800 million package to households to try and get them through this period of high inflation. Now, I mean, that comes at a time when the government has had to very quickly revisit its expectations around inflation. Treasury now expecting inflation to be not only higher but exist for longer throughout the next few years, which in of itself is quite remarkable. Treasury now expecting inflation to peak at over 6.7%, still be above 5% at the end of 2023, and still above 3% at the end of 2025. Themselves, as a government, really not expecting the Reserve Bank to be able to get inflation under control very quickly. Alongside that, we've had big announcements in the healthcare sector, with over $3 billion being used to wipe out the old deficits that DHBs were carrying, more investments into the likes of paramedics, hospitals. We've seen more helicopters for the healthcare service being provided, additional education investment and similar. There was quite a wide range of budget initiatives coming through that. What was very clear, though, with all of that expectation is that the government's got a lot to get on with, but still a real constraint around capacity to deliver, even at a time when we know from the new government accounts that the government is earning a fair bit more money as expected, as inflation is driving up the amount that government can bring in the door. But at the same time, those revenue figures are that the expense figures that the government is spending out considerably higher as well. I mean, with all of this additional government spending, just how worried should we be, Gareth, with the possible inflation that government itself might be driving across the New Zealand economy?
Yeah, certainly when we look at the growth in government spending over the last couple of years, I mean, it is clear that it has been a contributor to what is a very strong demand environment and a very strong inflationary environment at the moment. There was, of course, suggestions that the extra payment to households was going to maybe add some more to those inflationary and demand pressures. My guess is that it's going to be reasonably small in terms of the grand scheme of things around the sort of other cost pressures that are already being felt across the economy. I mean, what stood out for me, I think, amongst that, though, was that the government was very aware that they were under pressure in terms of the cost of living and needing to be seen to be doing something about that. And that sort of speaks to maybe some of the sort of almost ad hoc or scattergun approach that there has been around some of the policies that have been announced both prior to the budget and at the budget. But it was also interesting for me, you know, speculation in the week leading up to the budget, there was going to be possible tax cuts in there, despite the fact that Labor had very heavily criticised National's suggestion of those less than 2 months ago. So the fact that they found money to give to households, but it wasn't a tax cut, I mean, that was probably the way they went about it, probably not that surprising in the end, given the position that they'd put themselves in. It does mean, of course, that the government will still have plenty of money to throw around next year in some senses. We know that fiscal position is a bit under pressure, particularly as those costs increase. But we also know that the size of government has been increasing substantially over the last few years, whether it's in terms of the size of the health sector, and we know that's partly a response to COVID, but certainly in terms of the size of the public service more generally, and civil servants around Wellington, very strong employment growth coming through there, and a feeling that, you know, we haven't had any adjustments to those income tax thresholds for over a decade now. And so as inflation picks up, of course, and particularly wage inflation starting to pick up, that means that more and more people are going to be moving into a higher income tax bracket. There's going to be more revenue for the government in terms of GST as well. And so you can see it's a pretty easy process there for the size of government relative to the overall economy to keep increasing as well. And that is, I guess, what we kind of expect from a Labor government, that they have a lot of plans around spending and a lot of plans around how they want to manage the economy. And so as the government grows, that makes it easier for them to do that. Of course, they do still run the risk, as you mentioned, of running up against capacity constraints and a lack of resourcing across the broader economy. While the economy is coming under a lot of cost pressure, some areas within government, and you look at education or construction infrastructure, those sort of areas, we know there's going to be major cost pressures there, and so that will make it potentially more difficult for them to deliver on some of those programs that they are looking to push through over the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even with that, there's also the quite likely potential with inflation going higher and staying higher for longer, that government does need to provide more support from a political and perhaps also from an economic point of view to try and smooth what is going to be a very, very uncomfortable ride for lower income households as inflation continues to remain at that level. Remembering that Treasury is expecting inflation to stick around for a while, but really at the moment, the current plan is once October comes in 2022, we go cold turkey and there is no more support. Now, with the polls where they are, with the government wanting to be seen to be doing some of that work, you do wonder if there's more to come there. But you're absolutely right around the challenge of delivery. Now, last year, the finance minister was quite clear that there was an expectation that the government got on with its work come hell or high water. You know, it was a very forthright stance. This time round, though, the finance minister, in a direct question that I did ask him about this, did note that the government would need to calibrate their work program based around what sort of resources they could find, and that could well become a real issue. Treasury is now expecting that there isn't going to be a continued net outflow of New Zealanders for the next year or so out of the country, which makes it very, very difficult on a labour market front. But as well as that, inflation is starting to bite the government as well. 70% of the operating allowance in 2022 was just to meet those inflationary cost pressures. And really, as much as they've got a lot of money, they're going to have to make some very serious decisions next year for budget 2023. By Treasury's own estimates, the government's going to need $3.5 billion next year just for the total amount of capex, the total amount of cost pressure, rather, that is coming forward. Comes at a time when they're under pressure already to deliver on the capital infrastructure and similar. But so with that $3.5 billion needed just for cost pressure, the government only has probably around about $2.5 billion available to it in its operating allowance that it hasn't already allocated to try and fund it. So that missing billion is something that will either require more revenue to be found or something to be cut or reprioritised, as government often talks about it. So there is going to be a real difficulty in how the government tries to square the circle there. There is a huge amount of money going out there, but it is continuing to chase scarcer and scarcer resources, which is continuing to contribute to inflation. And probably the biggest challenge going forward is going to be how all of the various economic indicators match up. The government does expect now that interest rates will have to go higher to try and combat inflation, which will, in their terms at least, will expect the unemployment rate to increase to 4.8%. But at the same time, they're not expecting that inflation gets under control anytime soon with non-tradable. So that's the domestic-based inflation continuing to drive things over the next 3 to 4 years. And so certainly a worry that the New Zealand economy is not only pushing up against those capacity constraints now, but will do so in the future. And let's be real, there wasn't anything particular in the budget around the likes of productivity gains and similar. There is some long-term stuff, which is of course helpful, but it will take a while to come through yet. So a really difficult position, I think, the government finds itself in, with a lot of cash, but a lot of pressure as well on how to spend it, how to get bang for buck, and how to really execute what is quite a large work program and has a lot of perhaps thought and ideas flying around, but really a difficult amount or limited amount of people and resources to do all of that work. We'll assess how the government is going with executing that work program, what those expectations play out like, and how inflationary government spending might be on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.